Zora J Murff is an assistant professor of art at the University of Arkansas. Murff uses photography as a vehicle for exploring histories of American systems and the role imagery plays in shaping our belief in them. He is also a co-curator of Strange Fire Collective, a group of interdisciplinary artists, writers, and curators working to promote and construct an archive of artwork created by women, people of color, and LGBTQ plus individuals. Sasha Phyars-Burgess was born in 1988. She's Scorpio, Black, alive. Welcome, Sasha and Zora. Please take it away.
Well, thank you for having us. I'm really happy to be here, especially to share space with you, Sasha. So we met last October at the Midwest SPE conference, where we were in conversation with another one of my favorite artists, Nick Drain.
Everybody check out Nick Drain. Look him up.
Nick Drain. Yeah, Nick Drain is the truth. It was really fun being in conversation, and we had I think we had all entertained being in a book club at some point, but all of that, of course, didn't end up working out. But I think the nice thing was that you and I stayed in touch, and so I'm really thrilled to be here with you tonight and to have this discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Zora, for inviting me to be a part of this discussion with you. And thank you, Lori and Sarah, for having this, discussion on your platform.
And so I guess without any further ado, we'll just go ahead and jump into this presentation. I need to be able to share my screen. Okay, there we go. That's better.
That's that Zoom drama right there.
I know, right?
I need help sharing my screen. You're like, okay.
So, we're going to talk, through sort of this American history of images and, how it vacillates between an object that can cause harm, but can also be a tool for liberation. Before we begin, before we get into that tonight, it's important that, that we have to acknowledge that, if we were together tonight, that we would be on stolen land from people of the Lenape, the Susquehannock, and Iroquois people. And so, of course, there's also, other people that we need to acknowledge. Breonna Taylor, Oluwatoyin Salau, Tony McDade, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, Nina Pop, Layleen Polanco, and many other people. And so we would like to, of course, take a moment of silence for these individuals. But we would also like to maybe open it up to be a moment of giving through that reflection. So on the screen, you'll see a few organizations that we picked out together that we thought would be good to give to. So we're going to take this moment of silence, and if you can, please follow one of these links and donate some money. Okay. And so just, one last thing before we begin. I think it's always important to remember that, the work that's being done right now, people that are out in the streets, protesting for our rights, the small things that we do on a daily basis, having these difficult conversations, really digging into the ways in which, how pervasive white supremacy really is in this country, how it's baked into all of the systems that we are a part of and partake in. And it's so, in this work, it's always important to remember that, we often get short-sighted in discussing these things. And that, yes, that this moment we're talking about, the lives of, of Black people. Specifically, the conversation has been skewed towards Black men, but that this work has always been about the validation and liberation of all oppressed people. And so, all of this talk that's going on right now, it's for everybody. It's not just for one group of people. So we'll start here with this photograph, this diptych by Bill Gaskins, Sasha, who you studied with at Cornell. And so, we talked last week, and I talked about wanting to start with this diptych because I've enjoyed this work because I've always found it so succinct and simple. Sending a very clear message of what it means to be a Black person in America, what our experience is about, that the mountain really is higher. But I think, Bill has a little bit of writing on his site, that accompanies this photograph. And one thing he talks about in making this photograph, he was thinking about the Maryland doctrine of exclusion, which states, neither the existing Black population, their descendants, nor any other Blacks shall be permitted to enjoy the fruits of white society. And that was in 1638. And so from that point forward, there were these choices that were made. It was written into law what citizenship was. And at every turn, it was excluding anyone who wasn't a white man. So in 1680, you have the Virginia House of Burgess deciding what a white man is, as they were giving away land and rights. And who's able to reap those benefits. In 1691, legislation being passed in which the word white was used to describe full citizenry. Effectively establishing the use of race in the U.S. and a system, again, that was only meant to benefit white people. And then the Naturalization Act of 1790, which was, which limited the granting of citizenship to free white persons of good character. And so again, it's like these ways in which we see how our experiences are, how our experience in this country, was crafted, how it was designed and how it was determined, from these crucial points. And so maybe just using this as a sort of preface to what, we're going to discuss this evening.
Yeah. Something that I think I really liked about this image that is also kind of built into this discussion is how that idea of what you need to climb in order to reach the same level as white people in America is twice as high in order to do the same exact thing. And so I think this is also something that's kind of like built into the rhetoric of this message. Bill Gaskins, sorry, I just have to say this really quickly. Bill Gaskins, his seminal work is Good and Bad Hair, which it just had its 20th year anniversary this year. What, 30 years, 20 years, 2020, 30 years. And he's currently the head of graduate studies at MICA. And so I think that Bill does a lot of work around the imaginary, the pictures that built the American consciousness. And so I feel like this is a photograph in which he kind of reveals what is built underneath this American consciousness.
I like that a lot. Which I think, kind of carries us into, this image here. So this is an image by Theodore DeBry after John White, depicting an indigenous person. So, of course, we all know this history, Columbus arriving in what is now known as America, how information was translated back, and then how, people were exoticized, and then representations of them being created by, like through white gaze. And so here again, seeing, like kind of an example of a counter. And I really love this piece by Titus Kaphar, because to me, it's like, it's one of those artworks that just seems so effortless. The first time I saw this, I was like, oh yeah, exactly, right? Like it was just, yeah. But I think this idea of how, like when I was kind of making notes on this particular slide, I started thinking about like the difference between a photograph and an image. And, I think we consider like a photograph, and, like we only think about it like as this object, or like sort of like the definition of it is like, it's an object made using a camera. But an image, I think, gets us, far more deeper into what it is that we do as artists. Thinking about an image as a representation of, a person or a thing, a visible impression, an optical appearance, a mental representation, like. And so to me, I think that this, this image, it again sort of captures the essence of how we have been seen, how Black people have been seen. I think that, yeah, I mean, I'll let you go ahead here a little bit. So,
no,
Sasha, I don't want to talk too much.
No. So something that you had brought up earlier that I feel like an image versus a photograph, right? And the idea and the question that it all starts with the image, with the imaginary, with the imagination. And so I'm like taking it back there, because I think we need to remember that there's a racial imaginary that exists about Black people that is played out in real time every day, right? And so there is the thing that exists in the head that has become an object, and it becomes object by way of these expressions through other things that you have in the slideshow that we'll get to, these images that live in the mind. And these images that live in the mind are carried on with these certain ideas and things that people are told about these images that we carry. And so like in the DeBry slideshow, what I liked was that a lot of, when Europeans came to the American continent and they found the people that were living here first, they had an image in their mind about what they believed they were finding, and what they believed. First of all, they were looking for another group of people, and these are the people that they came across. And so they had these kind of like images in their mind of what they believed these people were, who they were. And that, I think, from its outset, created a certain type of misunderstanding that was fraught with violence. And so like, when I was like thinking about image and imaginary in terms of the racial imaginary, the racial image that exists of groups of people in this country, and how that, and what happens when those images, those imaginaries meet each other.
Hmm. Exactly. Well, I think, like we see what happens, right?
Right.
The blacks, whether a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to the whites in the endowments of both body and mind, right?
Hmm.
That moment when imaginary becomes concrete.
Right. And it is essentially what a systemically racist system is. It is when the imaginary is externalized into structure, and then it's like
Hmm.
we create these things and that cause, we create these systems in which people are constantly going to die because the imaginary has been externalized in a structure.
Exactly.
And something about Thomas Jefferson that I was thinking about, like, because like the conversation around citizenship, and I don't know, like you two,
Hmm.
what you might have been thinking about this, was that a lot of the founding fathers owned slaves, and Thomas Jefferson freed his slaves on his deathbed, all except he freed his slaves that were related to him on his deathbed. So those were the children that he had with Sally Hemings, and that a lot of these founding fathers knew that the act of slavery was wrong, but made justifications in which to keep going on with it. And I think something that I've been keep seeing or hearing, I guess, on other sides of the conversation is the question about like a reason why George Floyd or, Remy Fells or Lillian Polanco died. Like this kind of like reasoning, this justification for a death, which is just essentially a justification for a dehumanization. And so even though these founding fathers often like, it's like you're two steps, Jesus is coming for you, and you're like, the last thing I'm gonna do is free these people. They still held the belief, and many abolitionists held the belief that like these people were still inferior. We just kind of feel a little bit of guilt about what we've done.
Hmm. Well, I think about like how you talk about justification. And so where does photography fit into this conversation? And I think one way that it fits in is as justification. So these daguerreotypes made by J.T. Zeeley of enslaved individuals, he was commissioned by Louis Agassiz to make these to support an argument to support polygenesis, that Black and white people were created separately, and Black people were supposed to be the beast of burden, and so this image being used as proof to justify the enslavement of people, but it again it can exist in this other way. And so Alan Sekula talks about the shadow archive and how I think Ariella Azulay talks about this a lot as well. But that those moments when you like, if you think about the photograph in its context, you can begin to open new pathways to see the image differently than what it was intended to be seen, or how it was intended to be seen originally. And so we can think about, the photographer in the room, who else would have been in the room with them, the person who owned him, the person who was, again, like using our bodies as, like using our bodies for, ill intent. Yeah, but that, like, I guess it's important to begin to understand images in this way, because it might provide us, like, that information that, that takes us to, like, I guess, a better place, that can show us, our true faults. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so, carrying forward into history, so Currier and Ives was a printing firm. They operated from 1834 to 1907. And so this is, the type of image that Currier and Ives is known for. These are, very, common, sort of commonplace images. I remember my ex-wife, her grandparents had one of these in their living room. But these, it was, I think it's like one of the more well-known ones. It's like the American, like they're like these American like scenes, and they're like different seasons. And I think they actually might have had like a couple of different seasons. But they're very much like this, where it's like, a very idyllic scene, like it seems like, very jovial, very happy, very light. Even though, like in this image, there's a little dust up, people falling over and slipping on the ice, but, it's all in good fun, right? But, a history that we often don't talk about with Currier and Ives, and, that some people might be unaware of, is their series of Darktown comics. And so these images, were, where Black people are the butt of the joke, right? They're depicted, in these grotesque ways, really wide grins, big, bright pink lips. There's always, some sort of like mischief or something going on, the tattered clothing, and then, down to, the discussion, or like the text, Clardy track for Weeza Cummin, taking, Black vernacular English and making it, again, sort of this tool to, to poke fun. And so, yeah, like, we have these two very different images of America, but being, again, crafted through white gaze.
Yeah. So the two Currier and Ives images that you show, I feel like also, like something that I was thinking about with them is just kind of like placing them into their context in the time. Particularly this image is like an image that was made post-Reconstruction era. So that means like after, people are coming out of enslavement, and there's like that years where, the South is essentially an occupied territory, and that they're helping Black people get into office, helping all these things happen. At the same time, there's this other effort that's going on to continue to reinstate the kind of negative imagery around a Black human being, what a Black person is, kind of like they're, uneducated and things like that, in the same kind of ways that our images today are images that come both through like media and television, kind of reinforce our understandings of like how we might see people that live in heavily Black populated areas. And so I think there are ways that like the images that we understand of like a suburban area versus the images that we understand of like highly Black populated areas, I feel as though stem from this same kind of like imaging around like what is the happy and the jovial, and then what is the kind of like, the dark town,
Exactly. But then, like realizing that at this time, that this is what, like this is the type of imagery that was popular and existed. These imperialistic, images, where people of color are portrayed to be negative, and white people are portrayed as saviors and heroes. So this print by Udo Kepler, this is in, I believe, a British magazine called Puck. From the Cape to Cairo, though the process be costly, the road of progress must be cut. So this idea of the violence that comes along with progress, but then how that violence is justified in this type of image.
Mhm.
And so, you know, we have, you know, like these, you know, very, you know, kind of explicit examples. And then of course, you know, like like the ways in which it becomes just more and more subtle or implicit, you know, how it evolves over time and then just becomes so ingrained in culture that it can exist without question, for the most part. So these are a couple of soap advertisements on the left. You know, this idea of the white man's burden. So it's the white man's burden to go out to the world and get his hands dirty, you know, saving people in far-flung lands, and then of course needing soap to wash your hands after working with the unwashed. And then, you know, I like this image, like it every time, man. It's like they just, you know, they had to do it, right? Like, how could they not, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So that image.
Wait, go back.
Yeah, the pear soap image, and then the one before it, and this like discussion. I think, and I still think there is, to a certain extent, it's not as an explicit ideology, but it is still an ideology that I think is carried like underneath certain aspects of the American identity, is that there is this like bringing of a civilization or bringing of a certain type of thing to other groups of people, right? And so the thing about the Paris eyes images that I just looked at and I hadn't caught before is that they're at the bottom right, yeah, of this image. There's a man giving soap to another person that looks, or a person, I don't know if that's a man, giving to another person that is like that is pictured in the stereotypical kind of like native way, and that this idea that whiteness can, as salvation, as like as the thing that will pull you out of I guess your barbaric mess. And so it's like this, which is really interesting too, especially I feel like this I'm like gonna go on a tangent about this periscope thing for a minute. But the reason why I think this periscope thing is interesting because it's like low key, in my opinion, like an image about miscegenation, which was illegal in America at the time. And like it's kind of like, okay, so the only way that you can become white is to cleanse yourself. And ethnically, the way that was happening in America was that people were miscegenating, and during slavery times, it was like slavery was made matrilineal simply for the fact that if you had a drop of one, you could keep making slaves that way, right? So there was the forced kind of chattel slavery that was happening, where they were forcing people to have babies, but then, you know, slave masters or anyone can kind of have their way with the bodies of Black women and force them to have more kids to become slaves again. And so this, in a weird way, this soap image kind of like, I don't know if it's intentional in doing this thing of like calling on to that history, but that's kind of what it's making me think of. Like, I'm going to put you in the bath, make you clean, and then you'll be like one of us. It's like, I'll put myself inside of you and then you will become like one of us. And I think I don't know, I think these are the parts of history that I always have, like, I'm not quite sure how to understand them or like speak to them more. I think the very blanket thing is like, that like, you know, we can see like, yeah, it is low hanging fruit. It's like, oh, we'll just wash the black off of you. But then there's also this other thing, which is like, okay, so since we can't get rid of you, what are the ways in which we can eliminate you? And some of that is done through like ideas of genetics, even though like there were a lot of court cases in which, you know, Black people who were white, essentially passing for white, were like trying to go to the other side. So I don't know, it's like weird the way that there's like always this kind of like subtext within all of these images.
Well, I think, you know, this idea of subtext, and maybe this is something we can circle back to in a bit, but that like all of our experiences are subtext, right? That, you know, like every day that I walk down the street, in any encounter that I have with a white person, I have to think about subtext. You know, those slights that come in real subtly, right? You know, the things that can be said publicly, but, you know, can be explained away for this or that reason. And so how that subtext becomes a very important thing to be aware of, and something that, you know, like, at least in my experience as a Black person, you know, was like explained to me a lot as a kid. Yeah. So yeah, which, you know, like brings us to, you know, kind of back into today, right? You know, he's this Vice. I saw this Vice thing on Instagram, Sasha, and I seriously about spit out my coffee.
Sounds like an Onion article.
Right? But yeah, it's just like this idea of like, yeah, it's like, you know, admitting, and it's like, well, you've known the whole time because we've been telling you the whole time, right? But now that Blackness is trending, you know, we can decide that, oh my gosh, we made a huge mistake. But, you know, jumping back into our current line of inquiry, you know, like how these images of us have been crafted throughout history. And so you have, you know, minstrel shows on vaudeville. And so, you know, the first instances where white actors started putting on blackface, and again, sticking to like these sort of comical conventions of, you know, white perceptions of what Blackness is.
And again, it's the kind of overly exaggerated depictions that only live in the imaginary. Like, no white person, when white people started doing blackface, they knew they were wrong. They knew there was not any sort of accurate depiction of any Black person they had ever met or seen before in their lives. It was an idea that lived in their minds about what Black people were like. So the thing that they were seeing themselves and the thing that lived in their imaginary is like two different things. Like, I think about this often with the shooting of Michael Brown, because the officer that shot Michael Brown, he said that as he was shooting him, he thought that he was just bulking up and getting stronger, which is like just the opposite of human anatomy. Like, it's just, you know what I'm saying? But in the imaginary, I think because there is such this strongly held belief of Black people as being subhuman and superhuman at the same time, so that subhuman, that you're not worthy of being human, superhuman in the sense that you don't feel pain, you can get shot at. That's what I think about with the video of George Floyd also. It's like, if you had thought that that was a human being, would you have sat on that person's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds? Because if you could think that this person is human, there's no way in your mind that you could do something like that, because then you would be aware that you are currently committing a murder. That's just the way that I think about it. It's like, I think that there's a heightened sense of like, or idea of Blackness that lives in this imaginary amongst people. And I think that this imaginary is a collective imaginary that is often shared amongst not just, I don't want to say it's just white people, that lives in our consciousness of Black people as being superhuman. And it begins with the way they justified slavery. It begins with like, you know, all of the atrocities that happened during slavery, because they had to convince themselves that they could do this to a group of people because their bodies could withstand it. And I think this continues on now, that the way that Black people in America are treated is kind of like, well, they can withstand it, you know? And I think there's a difference between asking yourself, what can one withstand and what should one withstand? Because I think, yeah.
I mean, I think that's so well put. That was beautiful. Yeah, so we have these images, you know, that I think perpetuate those justifications, right? For whatever reason. And, you know, it like deeply ingrains these pejorative notions of us throughout history. So not only in media, but also in fine art, right? So these, the Cindy Sherman self-portrait was a series of self-portraits, right? From a series called The Best Writers. You want to talk about that a little bit, Sasha?
Yeah, so just really quickly, I want to say that I think in about 2016 or something, this artist, their name is E. Jane, they were a student at the University of Pennsylvania. They unearthed these images. I can't quite remember. I mean, I think they were like around, you know, but they put them basically on Twitter or Instagram or something. And they did this thing and it was called Syndicate. And it kind of like brought these images back up that everyone had forgotten about, because I think it's easy for a lot of people to do racist shit and think that the internet will forget, but it won't. And so E. Jane wanted to, like, was a reminder that Cindy Sherman's acts of kind of like trying on identities didn't just end at film stills. And so I can't quite remember if this happened before or after the film stills, but this kind of idea that she could or would be able to accurately portray or represent Black people that she saw sitting on the bus. I mean, I read something that Martin Berger wrote about it, and he felt as though in some ways that what she was trying to do was kind of like embody their experiences and dignify them. But I mean, that's a questionable take on this project, I think. And I think already just knowing the history and being so far away from, and being so close to the kind of like menstrual age for her to do something like this and for it to be actively forgotten. I feel like there's always Black artists, Black female artists in particular, that are kind of like bringing this back up. Like, don't forget Cindy Sherman. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, for real. Yeah. Well, and I think it's, you know, like this kind of larger question about, like when these images are created, you know, how they exist, and, you know, how we use them to talk about, you know, like the practice of art, right? And, you know, like what are those boundaries? But thinking about like this act of harm, you know, to me, it can't be outweighed by the very long history of our image being crafted outside of our hands. And so, so this is an example that I like to talk about with my students. You know, one, because it's like somewhat culturally relevant. You know, I think teaching is like quickly showing me like how fast I'm aging. My references get less and less relevant. They become only relevant to me in the classroom. But that aside, you know, I think that, you know, like Mad Men was like, it was an interesting watch for me, you know, watching the series, just because, you know, of course, I think I was able to look past all of the sort of, you know, kind of the immediate nostalgia that we often get wrapped up in, you know, the sort of glitz and glamour, you know, the design of the age, and, you know, sort of the flashiness and all of that. But, you know, like, of course, you know, as I'm watching it, it's like, this isn't my experience, right? You know, experience that like was not crafted for me. And so, you know, I saw, like, I think in watching it, I saw the subtle social critique that was happening, that like, you know, like everyone is so quick to kind of glorify this age, but like all of these, you know, all these people were doing like, you know, pretty awful things, you know, be it racist, be it misogynistic, you know, whatever it was. And I think what was nice about it was that it would happen like with such ease, and it would just kind of hit every, you know, like, you know, here and there, where just something would happen and you're like, holy shit, that was racist. That was racist as hell. And it just happened so quickly. But I mean, that's like how it happens in real life, right? Yep. And so, you know, this like moment where this character who, you know, kind of becomes like this kind of beloved character, right? You know, does this, again, this very harmful and violent act. But yeah, I think like that's why I like to kind of point to this example in popular media. And so like, you know, how do we read this moment? You know, do we lambast the show, you know, or do we take a harder look at where we come from? and the things that we've done and continue to do, right?
Yeah, I actually also remember watching this with watching Mad Men and this scene coming up, and like I'll say Roger Sterling's one of my favorites. He's a hot mess, and I almost feel like I really liked. I don't want to say liked, but it was a good reminder for me to be like, and he was a racist. You know, it was a good reminder for me to like remember that in all the multitudes that exist within this person, within this character on this show that could potentially be a person, there was also this thing that existed within him. And there's a thing that I think we all can exist within all of ourselves, and that we need to take out and look at and like remember how casual racism really is, because it's like, it's super casual, you know? I think as a Black person, I'm sure many other people of color can talk about similar experiences of just kind of like going about your day and you'll be like, oh, something racist just happened. And then you're like, damn it, I was just living my life. You know what I mean? Like, I was really just minding my good old 2 cents. And then this racist ass thing just happened. And now I have to contend with that racism. And I think what's happening right now is that white people are at a certain moment in time, and this moment will pass. But right now, we're at a moment in time where white people are going to be asked to confront that racism. And if the moment, if anything is going to come of this moment, you have to remember that 6 months from now, when we're in 2021 and we forgot about coronavirus and we like low-key forgot about, and it's winter and we're sad and upset, that racism is still going to be there. So like, you still have to pick it out and look at it 6 months from now and a year from now and 2 years from now, because it doesn't go away. And so like,
exactly.
Yeah, I think this moment, and I think they did it often in Mad Men in subtle ways. It just reminds you that like when there was like a Black character that tried to come in and be a copywriter, and they had the Black woman that tried to come in and be secretaries and things like that. And I think they had like accused one of the women of stealing or something. And it's like, yeah, this is still here. As your life goes on, don't forget that this thing is still happening.
Exactly. And so, you know, examples that happen in real life. So this is an example, this is a student at the University of Arkansas where I teach. You know, this wasn't the only racist image that was made in, you know, a very short period of time. But yeah, like this idea of, you know, how do these acts perpetuate these acts?
So when this happened on your campus, kind of like what happened? Do you remember?
So, I mean, I think right now, like there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of outrage, rightly so. You know, like the university is taking some steps, but I don't know what's happened with the students. Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, just kind of, if you're interested, I guess, keep your eyes peeled on the news. But one thing that you can do is you can also check out the hashtags Black at UARC on Twitter, and then also Black in the Ivory, because I think, you know, yes, we can talk about what's happening at the University of Arkansas, but that this experience is all academia. And so, you know, just read, you know, if for those who were interested, I mean, I read through them the first day, you know, Black and Ivory started, you know, trending, and, you know, I read through Black at UARC, but it was like, you know, I can't look at it anymore, but I suggest that everyone else does who's here. Yeah, a very clear sort of picture of, you know, like academia isn't exempt of this by any means, not by a long sight. And so, you know, I guess that brings us here. And so this is, you know, a quote by Michelle Alexander recently from the New York Times. "It's not enough to learn the broad outlines of this history. Only by pausing long enough to study the cycles of oppression and resistance does it become clear that simply being a good person or not wishing Black people any harm is not sufficient." And so kind of, you know, going to your point, right, that 6 months from now, racism is still going to exist you know, Black people are still going to exist. And that if this is truly about changing at this time, that we have to remain vigilant, and we have to continue holding ourselves accountable. And, you know, like, just as every day I have to confront my Blackness in this world, you know, white people need to confront their whiteness on a daily basis as well. You know, this is the world in which we live in now. And so, yeah, so now we're, I guess, to the portion of the evening where we talk about our artwork. And so when you know, we had first, you know, kind of like discussed this idea, this kind of learning exchange. You know, I think that, like, you know, whatever I may have said in that initial email, because I don't think this is like even sticking to the original plan we had laid out. But, you know, I guess, like, you know, to me, it's been really nice, you know, kind of having this sustained discussion with you, because it's really helped me, like, further along in my own sort of research and thoughts about the work that I'm making. And so, yeah, I'll let you pass the mic to you.
Yeah, so I think because we chose the next few images because they were like kind of questions or images that we felt as though spoke to or included the question of citizenship within them or implicit in them or around them, right? And so I think I know this, but I think it's kind of important to this, or if you feel as though it's important to this, if you could talk about the story behind this image, like what led to the moment in which you took this photograph. And my other question is, how many photographs did you take?
Yeah, so actually, like, I mean, I think this is a photograph I've been thinking about for a really long time. But I think it took sort of this kind of series of events playing out for me to kind of get there. And then, yeah, like, there's some serendipity that is, I'll just tell the story. So, my wife, Raina, who's in the other room, I can hear myself on reverb. Hi, Raina.
What's up? Shout out to Raina Young. Everybody check out Raina.
Everybody check out RainaYoung.com. She's not gonna say anything. Okay, anyway, so yeah, so we she just yelled at me. Yeah, so we were taking our New Year's trip, your holiday trip, and we went to this to rent a car for the week. And you know, they had this BMW, and as I'm driving it, I'm noticing, like, all of these, like, sort of looks, and not, like, you know, like, hateful or spiteful looks, but just, like, genuinely confused looks. Yeah, like, very curious. I mean, there was, like, one guy in a Volvo, white guy, who, like, slowed down and kept pace with me and just kept looking at me, sped up, and, like, went past me a good way, slowed back down to look one more time, and then drove off again. I mean, I can't make this shit up. Like, that really happened. And so, you know, I'm, like, at this point in my life where I'm thinking a lot about, like, you know, sort of success, right? Like, I set out to go to graduate school to become a professor, and lo and behold, you know, here I am in this moment, you know, kind of living out my dream. But then getting this reminder of, you know, like, what sort of success is determined for me in the imagination of white people. It's, you know, often an experience that I've had here on campus for the past 2 years. Anytime I go to take a smoke break, anytime that I engage with somebody, the first question they have for me is not, what do you do here? It's, what graduate program are you in? Like, again, this idea that I cannot be imagined in a position of authority solely based on my physical appearance, right? And so thinking a lot about those things, So like having, like access to this really wonderful BMW 7 Series, like literally the nicest car I've ever driven in my life. It's quite an experience. But like this, like this, like these sort of status symbols, and like, what do these things really mean? And then, kind of what exists underneath that, like, what am I aspiring to? And sort of like the kind of conflict that exists in that, right? Because again, I have a predetermined destiny in the eyes of whiteness. And so yeah, I was working with my my former professor and now close friend, Walker Pickering. And he was like helping me and like kind of set up the shot, and he was gonna like take the picture while I was posing. And this was actually an accidental shot, and so there were like some others that we made. And this is like, like this one, like for some reason it kind of hit me, but then I remembered, like, I guess like as I looked at it, I remembered Hippolyte Bayard's self-portrait of a drowned man. And so like this kind of similar sort of posture, right? Like, I mean, it was the posture, I think, that took me there. But then also, kind of like the, kind of the circulated story behind that photograph, like him feeling slighted for not being recognized for, quote unquote, inventing photography, right? And so making this self-portrait of himself as a drowned man, to kind of, maybe deal with that emotionally. And so like how, like it created like this really nice kind of circular way of thinking, this medium that I practice, which of course is founded in whiteness, right? And was used as a tool to benefit whiteness. But then something that I do and something that I love, like this idea of, aspiring towards, like sort of like, kind of what I've come to understand as success, through my life experiences. And then the kicker, which I didn't know this, I showed this to my friend Sonny, and he told me, he was like, oh man, like, yeah, BMW, it was like pejoratively, it's used as Black man's wish, right? Again, like this symbol that is like imagined for me, right? Like, oh, you can never have this. This is just a wish for you. And so like, yeah, like sort of this serendipity or these overlaps that like, came from this photograph. But that's, again, like what we do as artists, right? Like that's like, that's where we, kind of, that's the area, that space in which we work, where we try to find all of these confluences and figure out how to bring them out in form.
Yeah, I think this is something that I really, really like what you just told me about it being kind of a callback to the Hippolyte Bayard photograph, Portrait of a Drowned Man, and also the thing that you are talking about in terms of the BMW. And I think the layers, I mean, one of the things that I think is that photography can be very adept at doing is being able to call on past histories through the thing that you see now. And I guess technically that's what all images do in a way, because we are like a compository of like the images that we have seen in our lives. But I think that this in particular, self-portrait of a dreamed man, self-portrait of a drowned man, are these kind of both aspirational images in which the thing itself can't be reached. Like Hippolyte Bayard, the invention of photography is so weird because it was like happening in France, England, and Brazil at the same time. And so like the people that we remember are the Anglo-speaking people, which is like a whole other thing we could get into, and we won't. But like, I think that what this idea of him inventing this thing and then it being kind of forgotten, and how does he sort of remember himself, and then you kind of finally attaining these certain achievements, these milestones, these marks that are kind of like promised within American society, and still not being able to kind of feel the joy or the happiness that one is supposed to feel when they attain something like this, like, being able to drive a BMW or being able to like be a part of this kind of group of people, like the academia class is what I'm thinking of. And so it's like, I think the question of going back to, of like, what are we aspiring to, also is a question that I guess I'm thinking about within this image. Like, if we are aspiring to, like, when I think of the word citizen, and when I think of citizen historically in this country, I know that word was meant to be for originally white, landowning, able-bodied so they could work the land, cisgendered so they could reproduce, heterosexual so they can make more people to get that land, male because it's a patriarchal society. And so and sometimes I have to ask myself, and this is just a personal question for me, like, is this the citizenship that I'm trying to attain? Are these the things that I'm trying to attain if inherent within them is not a space for me or literally anyone but like 20% of the population? And so if a society is built for 20% of the population, what does that mean for everybody else? I mean, I don't even know. Yeah. I'm like curious, how many white men are there? Like, I don't even know. White men in the chats, how many of them are there? How many? Can we get a count? No, I'm kidding.
Okay, I guess we'll move on to your photograph. I think I think something that like has continually drawn me to your portraiture is or I guess maybe I would say all of your images, like from what I've seen, because I can't find your work, Sasha, because you only put one image out at a time. But I think that, there's, the moment always feels authentic. It never feels, like, I think when I look at your photographs, I think I feel your presence, but it's like your presence doesn't interrupt the moment, if that makes sense. And I think particularly, like, or maybe it especially shines through when you make a portrait where somebody's looking back at you. And so, I mean, I have like, I think I have a couple of different questions about it. I think I want to save one for like the other image that, like another one of your images that we're going to see. But maybe in this one, like maybe you can talk about the moment, like how, like, yeah, like how does the moment relate to your practice?
So like the quick backstory to something that I think I should explain very quickly, the history that kind of led me to shooting in this way. So I think as a photographer, as however many photographers are a part of this right now, there was a history of photography that I was looking at all the time that I loved very, very much, and that I tried to emulate, that was being inside in the world in a certain way. So like, I'm a big fan of like, Ouija is one of my favorite photographers, but then we can talk about the Stephen Shores, the Sternfeld. I'm like not remembering anybody's name right now, but y'all know who I'm talking about, right? So it's like this idea of going out into the world and just kind of like the flaneur, like I'm like walking and photographing. And I always had this, like, I asked myself, like, why can't I make these pictures? I kept trying to make these pictures over and over again. And it was like I came up against the block. And I think that within this is me also having to like question my like, the attainability of whiteness within myself, question all these like patriarchy within myself. But ultimately what I realized was that the way that these white men were in the world, it was not possible for me to be in that way in the world. So it was not possible for me to go onto the street and just have a photograph camera and be in people's face and photographing people and not and have the same reactions. It wasn't possible because I am behind the camera. And so I had to take myself into account, and I had to understand what that meant to have this body and what this body means in the world. And so I'm not talking about me, Sasha Phyars-Burgess, whatever that is. I'm talking about my body. I'm talking about my gender, whatever, the appearance of my like sexuality, my visage, all of that stuff. So what does that mean when I bring me into the space with the camera? So then I realized, okay, there's no fly on the wall stuff. Like, I'm here, right? So like, I might as well just be here. And so with this image, I think that I was in Mississippi. I was visiting my friend in Jackson, Mississippi, and she knows I like to take photographs, and she's a teacher, and her name is Alita, and she took me out with some of her students, and we just hung out and photographed. And basically, it was like they had this baby, like this girl's sister just had a baby, and they were passing the baby around. A lot of it is just like, okay, I'm going to take photos, but then, you know, other stuff happens. And so they were holding the baby like that, playing with the baby. And then I was somewhere else and I saw, and I was like, oh, I want to take a picture of that. And so I just came and photographed it.
Mm. Well, how do you know when the moment is an important one to point your camera at?
I don't know. I guess that's the question we're all trying to answer, right? When we take photographs. No, seriously. Like, how do I know? I don't know. I'm just like, that's the thing.
Yeah.
No, how do you know? How do you know? No, seriously, how do you know? I guess
yeah, how do I know?
Can we go to your picture next? No, really, can we go to your picture next? Because I
let's
feel
go.
like it's a good example of this. Okay, so I actually have a lot that, like, I'm also curious, like, how many photographs you took of this, but, like, how did you feel as though this was a moment for you? Because I feel like, again, this is an image that is very loaded. Also, so like, I would like for you to talk about the title, ideally, and then also, yeah, like, how did you know this was it?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, it's, okay, I'm trying to figure out the best sort of way in. So this was made, this is me and Chris Graves. This is while we were at Syracuse at Lightwork, doing our residency together. And yeah, like, I think it was, you know, like, for me, I had just finished grad school, you know, like, I had busted my ass 3 years making this work, and you know, like, it's that moment when, like, you know, you've done the thing, and then you're like, all right, like, what do I do next, you know? And so not really having any sort of direction, but knowing that, like, you know, I can spend my time here, you know, walking around and sort of making the photographs that I know how to make, right? But wanting to try something different, but not really knowing what that different was, you know, outside of, like, maybe, you know, kind of some aesthetic choices, knowing that I wanted to make something where I had to, where I had to stage or craft a scene, you know, considering those things. And you know, we had gone to the bank to get some cash. I needed to do my laundry, and the bank gave me this old $20 bill, and I was enamored with it because it just reminded me of like, that was the amount of money that I would get for my allowance when I was a kid. And, you know, so it was always like Friday, you know, it was like, I was excited to see that $20 bill, right? Like, run into the house after school, you know, kiss mom on the cheek, thank you for my $20. And then, you know, out to have a fun night, you know, as far as $20 can get you when you're 14 years old. And so, you know, but, like, thinking about, like, sort of like that kind of act of tenderness and support, right? You know? And so, like, you know, I kind of had these, like, visions in my mind of that, you know, that moment. And I was like, well, why can't I just craft that moment? And so that's all I really set out to do. And I think, you know, again, kind of just, like, stumbled into, you know, this really great image. And so yeah, like the title, it just comes from like this term that was in my head for a really long time, affirmations in a crisis. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I had already had like this desire to make an image that was about this sort of affirmation or support. This idea of these two black hands, supporting, one black hand supporting another black hand. But then kind of like the insidious moment within that moment of support. And I feel like kind of what I'm trying to do right now is, I'm obviously doing this sort of critique of self, trying to figure out, I've made work in this very particular way. I learned in this very particular way. And so, I think I'm trying to find where I genuinely exist within that. And so, yeah, like it's just like this really sort of hard look at myself. And so I feel like, as I'm making these newer photographs, I'm trying to make images that are complicated in the sense that you want to feel good about them, but maybe there's something there where you can't quite feel so great about it, right? Like or maybe kind of, oh, go ahead.
No, it's just a question about what you said about the kind of the thing that is insidious within the image. And I feel like that's something you're about to get to.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think it's like, just like, kind of like with the BMW image, like, kind of what are you aspiring to? And so, yeah, like within this act of support, like, yeah, like that this, slave owner is present and his eye is like looking back, right at you, the viewer. And yeah, so I think it's like, yeah, I'm still trying to find like the ways in which to explain it, but I feel maybe like in this moment, this moment right now, I've experienced like really rapid success in light of what's going on in the world. Like both at large and within kind of our own community of photography. And so like this, yeah, all of this success kind of like that didn't exist, before George Floyd was murdered. And now that we have to reckon with race in this moment in a really like in a concrete way, like, yeah, like where is this success coming from? Because I've been me this entire time. So yeah, like it just highlights the problem, right?
I think it's so interesting within the word affirmation too, because I think in this current moment there is something like slightly disturbing about this rush to like everybody's on the black train now. Someone's been on the black train, and it's like hard to. It's both welcome in the sense that you have been making work. We have been doing all these things, calling attention to what's been going on in this world. Sorry, sitting in the dark. What's been going on and what's been affected by us since you and I were born and, 400 years prior to that. But I think the moment when it becomes, and to speak to this image, the moment when it becomes something that affects the dollar is the moment when it becomes something that's necessary. And so I think, I think often about the fact that anti-racism, anti-racist work, being anti-racist is in a lot of ways antithetical to capitalism. And like, that's like a whole thing, but it really is because there is at this point in human history, no real benefit besides for white people to not be racist. And I think the moment when, and I think what is happening right now is that it is becoming a monetary issue. And so when it becomes an issue of money, I think people feel more inclined to move. And so it's like within this kind of affirmation, there's this thing in which we kind of replicate this system that asks for us to uphold it by upholding certain standards that don't allow us to kind of do the thing that's against the system, which is to reaffirm one another. So I like both the affirmation within this because it reminds me weirdly of the Sistine Chapel and this kind of like life-giving gesture, both of the two hands touching one another, but then also of the past, like I'm passing money to you. $20 seems like a lot of gas money. Well, I'm passing money to you. You know, I'm passing money to you. I am, and for us, money is a life-giving resource. But then within that, there is this thing that we need to uphold that makes the money important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, yeah, and I think that like maybe something I didn't highlight enough was that like, yeah, like a fundamental sort of tenet in making the images was like, yes, there is sort of that cut that comes in, right? But we can still have a good time while we're looking at this, right? And so I think, yeah, and I feel like a lot of my, you know, well, my, you know, the work that I've made before, it's like immersed in such kind of heavy stuff, and not to say that, you know, like this isn't heavy as well, but I think that I'm like looking for also like this sort of lightness or levity in the work too. You know, as again, something that, you know, I'm not well versed in as an artist. And so I want to, you know, of course, try to do that more. And so I think we're almost to the, like, we should probably get to the Q&A here, but I want to talk about this photograph as well.
Okay.
And so maybe we won't get to the last two. But
also, I just want to say someone named Bennett Pavlov in the chat also, as like a really good reminder and a thought about the weight of money, said that George Floyd was murdered for supposedly passing a counterfeit 20, a prescient image. So like, I think that's just a reminder about money in our society.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that comment. So yeah, this photograph, and I think when you sent your selections, like, you know, of course I can't help but think about, you know, the gays again, but another conversation that we've had a couple of times, and like, you know, like kind of bringing it back to this idea of citizenship, is like your experiences in Chicago and photographing people in Chicago, and thinking about your own Blackness based on, you know, like these sort of regional experiences, right? Yeah, and so like I'm interested in just hearing you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So my family's Trinidadian. I'm a first-generation American, and I came to Chicago because I applied for a fellowship called the Diane Daymeyer Fellowship for Photographic Justice, which is spearheaded by Columbia College of Chicago and Heartland Alliance in Chicago, and it was co-created, and my mentor in the program is Judy Natal. And so that's how I ended up in Chicago. So like that's just the backstory of why I was there, because that's not where I'm from. And in coming to Chicago, I learned a lot about the city's history, and I have come to understand it as like, for me, it's like the most American city. I feel like it's very American, and I feel like the Black people there are like really American, because it was like one of the cities that was boomed by the Great Migration. And so when I first got to Chicago, I was photographing in this neighborhood called Austin in conjunction with the Daymeyer Fellowship. And it's a neighborhood. I was photographing in this program called READY, which stands for Rapid Employment and Development Initiative. And it's a program that gets young men that are affected by gun violence, either they're perpetrators of gun violence or they've been affected by gun violence, and puts them in this program where they get cognitive behavioral therapy and job training. And then they also get personal professional development. And so I would come in 2 days a week, and I would do this media class thing there where I was like, basically like teaching them. I wasn't teaching them anything. We were making a movie. We were trying our best to make a movie. And so we would photograph and stuff and like make this movie that was like based off their life experiences. And so in being in that neighborhood, I learned so much about America's laws and how neighborhoods like this come to be. And I think the narrative around Chicago and gun violence is just like, Chicago, like the people are shooting in Chicago, but there's not as much of a like an understanding of like how certain neighborhoods came to be this way. And like through my understanding of disinvestment, social neglect, economic neglect, I began to understand like, okay, well, how and why does someone like pick up a gun to defend territory essentially, or to defend their honor, or to defend whatever, what have you. And so in this photograph, it was like in the first like couple months that I was there. And so I would basically, like, they would know I was photographing, and I would set my camera up, and they're actually watching a computer screen like they were watching a movie. And I would just kind of like photograph them as things were going on. And like Chicago's history as a distinctly American city also, I think, like the Midwest is highly segregated, and I think most like the most top 10 highly, like the number one highly segregated city might be Madison, Wisconsin, or something like that, and then it's probably another thing in Wisconsin, and then Chicago or something like that. And basically all of the laws, all of the experimentations that were put into place to keep Black and white people separated, to keep segregation a thing, were tested out in Chicago first. And so it was like very interesting for me to be there and be reading about the history and then seeing it on like the ground. So this neighborhood, Austin, is like one of the hottest neighborhoods in Chicago. So that means it's one of the neighborhoods that experiences like the most gun violence, but it's also highly disinvested in. It's the second largest neighborhood, or the largest neighborhood, and it also has the largest population. So you have to think about what it means when a city neglects an area that has the most people living in it in a city, you know, and then that's the area that's the most neglected. And what do people do for themselves there? Like, something I think about often is like where you grew up and the availability you have at jobs as a teenager. And I never really understood why that was a big deal until I was in these areas. And then I thought to myself, okay, if you're like 14 years old and you want a job, or 15, I guess 16, where do you go if there's nowhere in your neighborhood where you can get a job? And in order to get out of your neighborhood, you got to take 2 buses and a train. Who's doing all that to get a job if you don't have a car, or things like that? I think it was the little things that helped me understand the larger story of like of race and racism and structure in America. And so I guess with this image, really it's just about, I mean, I think the gaze in my photographs is just acknowledgement of their presence and my own, in a way. I don't know quite how to explain that, but like, people look at me because I'm looking at them.
Right, yeah. Well, I think it's there's always such like a warmth in the images, you know, that you make, and just this level of intimacy. And I think it's like, you know, an intimacy that, you know, like, I think it's one of those things. I don't know how you feel about this, but like, you know, as someone who makes portraits, it's almost like falling in love with somebody really fast, and then like you separate like in that moment, you know, like, I mean, like, it's like you experience an entire relationship with somebody, like all at once. But it's like, for me, it's more like in sort of my traditional practice, it's like, it's more brief. But like, yeah, I think like, I guess like the work that you do with the organization, I think maybe is something that lends to that intimacy, because I think you're present in multiple ways, you know, for these individuals that you're making images of, right? And so I feel like that kind of carries a particular weight in your work. And I think it's maybe that's like the sort of thing you're talking about that you can't maybe quite express.
I mean, I think really shortly, like, to look at someone, and I mean like to like really look at someone, ideally in the Martin Luther King sense and the Jane Baldwin sense, is an act of love, to open oneself up and to see another, right? And I think that's like the thing that you're talking about. And I think this is a very hard thing to do. I think we project ourselves everywhere. We can't help it as human beings to project. But I think to really, or the goal for me is to try my best to look at someone. I think that's what like good portraiture or portraiture that can be moving is like someone is looking.
Yeah, well, I think it's maybe, and I think we could spend, like the next hour talking about representation, but I think it also has a lot to do with like a lot of the images that we, like we're showing, before, like in the first part of the slideshow, because those are images that we're familiar with, right? And we know that like we've been crafted to exist in this particular way. And so, I don't know. I mean, of course, like, we are conscious of, like trying to make, these positive representations of ourselves. But that, like, I think fundamentally in that, it's just, like acknowledging somebody else's humanity. But I like that you talk about how you try to be as sort of fair in that process as you can, but understanding that, like, at least in my opinion, that it's always going to be fundamentally flawed because there's a power dynamic, right? And so, yeah, I like that you don't sort of put it in that kind of absolute that, like, you always make the positive image. Like, all images are troubled, right? Yeah. Well, I think we're closing in on the time, so we won't get to these. Maybe we can talk about these next time.
Okay.
But we can still do some Q&A. But before we jump into the Q&A, again, this reminder that, again, this work is not solely about solidifying the existence and liberation of Black men, that this is about the liberation of all oppressed people. And so we're going to close out again with another moment of silence. And Sasha, go ahead.
Yeah. So we must acknowledge Breonna Taylor, Olutoyin Salao, Tony McDade, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, who's actually from York, Pennsylvania and found in Philadelphia, Nina Pop, and Laylene Polanco. These are just a few of the names of Black women and trans people who have died by police violence and also interracial violence during this time. So we're going to have another 90 seconds of silence and a donation period. Okay. Right. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. So we can take some questions, unless you got a jet, Sasha. You got to go?
No, I can stay for a few
Okay.
questions.
Yeah, I mean, we could maybe just do a few.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, should we do, okay, yeah, here we go. From Carolyn Drake. Do you feel that the structures of sexism have something in common with structures of racism in our society? Is it problematic to consider where the two overlap? I mean, while also understanding the ways that the ideas about white femininity have been used to justify racism and violence against Black men. You know, I think that like, yes, I mean, I think that those things should be considered, you know, and how like, consider how like those things overlap. You know, like if we talk about, or if we think about the history of spectacle lynching, you know, in America, and, you know, how that was justified through sort of the protection of, you know, the sanctity of white womanhood. You know, I think that's like an immediate overlap. But yeah, I mean, I think there's, yeah, like I think all of these things overlap that we should consider their intersections. That those are important discussions to have. And I think, you know, like like sort of the point that, you know, like, you know, both Sasha and I were trying to make in the way that we introduced this talk was that, again, like I feel like we often miss the mark, and like, you know, kind of centering what is right in front of us, but like trying to remember that like all of this work that is going into it is, you know, to fight, you know, like all of these sort of forces, whether it's white supremacy, whether it's patriarchy, that oppress multiple people in different ways. And so it's always important to think about those things in tandem,
Yeah.
and the ways in which like they relate. Yeah.
So I think I'm just gonna read. Do you feel the structures of sexism have something in common with the structures of racism? Okay, so I think that there's, of course, the structures in sexism and racism do overlap, and I think like basically I just want you to remind you that Black women exist. I often feel like Black women exist, Black gay people exist, Black trans people exist. And so if you're wondering if the structures of racism and sexism have overlap in the society, like, yeah, Black women exist. And so they are experiencing both structures simultaneously. And if you're wondering about writings and works by authors, there's a really, Nadia Nakorda said Black feminist theory. Yeah, a book that I want to recommend right off the top, because I mean, Black Feminist from Margin to Center by Bell Hooks will really give you the rundown. I think that we need to remember the ways that Black men were given the right to vote before white women, and that was a sticking point for white suffragists. We need to understand the ways, exactly like how you mentioned, that white femininity has been a way to prop up white supremacy in society, and the way that the white womb has been an idea of something that needs to be kept pure away from this kind of like dirty Blackness that exists. And so if you are, I think that there are people that live at the center of, R. Sanders just said also the notion of like a lot of people are putting things in the chat that you should look at. I think we need to remember that there are human beings that literally exist at this center every single day and are experiencing these things, and we're experiencing it from both ends. So, you know, we're experiencing, like, we can talk about the ways in which white feminism's second wave was interested in getting into the workforce, a workforce that women of color, Black women, had already been in from the beginning. So yeah, I just think that everyone should remember that Black women exist. Black women exist. That's all I have to say about it. That's my answer.
All right.
Look, you know, 90 minutes out of deep respect for the two artists that presented tonight. I really want to end this when we said we would end it, and I hope that's okay with everybody. This was enlightening, and I'm pretty sure, especially for the white folk that could join this talk tonight, thank you very, very much. If it's okay with you, I want to end with, you all said so many things, I was writing down so many quotes, but I want to end with one of Sasha's quotes. if it's okay. Unless you have some last words you want to say. Let me say what I loved is to really look at someone is an act of love. And I really appreciate that, Sasha, and I really appreciate Zora. Thank you very much. And y'all can wrap it up the way you want to wrap it up as well.
Yeah, so, yeah.
That's it. All right.
Thank you, Zora. Thank you.
I mean, yeah, it was fun.
Yeah,
We'll see you again
sorry.
at the
It was
next
fun. It was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you so much for your generosity.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
All right.
Bye.
All right.